Content warning. The following video contains non-graphic discussions of sexual coercion, manipulation, mental and emotional abuse, and general abuses of power. All right. So, I wasn't sure I was going to do this, but it didn't matter. Doesn't matter if I wanted to. It happened. There are additional allegations against Neil Gaiman since the video I did before, and some people had been wondering whether or not I was going to do a follow-up, and I debated it largely because I didn't want to, but I did do my due diligence and look into the new allegations on the new podcast, new episode of the podcast that had done it before, and one episode of a podcast that is new to this conversation, and tried to figure out if I had anything to say, and yeah, I do. That having been said, I intend for this video to be the last time that I talk about this. We'll get into a little bit more of why I'm kind of putting my foot down about this when I get to the back end and really get into my own thoughts about integrating the new information. Again, to save people who don't want to go through all the specific details, there's a time code. If I'm really lucky, it's not as monumentally far down the line as it was last time. All right, couple of quick overviews. I've already done a video on the previous allegations and all the problems that I have with the reporting done by the outlet Tortoise Media. I am going to try as much as I can to not reiterate anything I already said in that video. Check it out there if you haven't seen it already. You kind of need that information if you're going to be watching this entire thing. So beyond that, where we currently stand, we are still in a situation where no major news outlet has run original reporting on this issue. Now, to be clear, this is not to say no outlet has reported about the allegations. They have. Like, a couple people pointed me to a Rolling Stone article, but that wasn't really an article. That was more a pointing to the fact that there was new allegations from new podcasts. It was not actually original reporting. What I've been hoping for a while is for an outlet that is better established, or that I have more faith in, because Tortoise Media, I didn't know them before looking into this, and my experience with their work has not ingratiated me to them. But as I continue to hope for a larger outlet with a stronger reputation, at least to me, to look into this, that is still not happening. Does not mean it is not going to, but if I were to hazard a guess and be a tiny bit speculative, given that up until the most recent allegations, none of these women were going on record with their full name, that would mean that it is, well, at the very least, going to be difficult for any other outlet to find them, and it's distinctly possible that those women don't want to talk to other outlets. They've already said their story once, and you are kind of asking somebody to relive their trauma to ask them to tell a story that they've already told, and they can just point you to the podcast. You know what I mean? So that could be one of the reasons that independent, or not independent, but other major mainstream outlets haven't really done independent reporting on this. Again, I'll point out they have talked about it, but only really to point at the podcast. Now, I do want to head off some conspiratorial nonsense that I saw in the comments last time. Don't talk about Gaiman like he's got some massive pull. He's influential. He is beloved. He's not Harvey Weinstein. He doesn't pull at the strings of power. He doesn't have that kind of influence. Nor do I believe that mainstream media is somehow defending him and refusing to cover this for some frickin' conspiratorial nonsense reason. There is no reason to believe that. The most likely reason that there isn't new reporting from other outlets is they have not yet gotten sufficient material to do independent verification of any of this, or to find new things that aren't already out there. They may very well be trying, but so far that hasn't happened. That's the simple, most likely reason. I'm going to go with Occam's razor on this. The simplest explanation makes the most sense. As for Gaiman himself, he has yet to make any public statement or appearance. He's actually canceled a couple of tour dates, which is not surprising, because even if he doesn't bring up the topic himself, if he makes an appearance at anything where people are allowed to ask him questions, he's going to get bombarded with questions about this. He knows that. He's not going out. Other than the cancellations, there hasn't really been anything. So no statements, written or video or interviews. Right now, total silence, which, yeah, like, I don't know what else he could do, honestly, unless he has actual evidence to meaningfully discredit, like true evidence to counter the claims that wasn't already in some way covered by what's out there. Then there's literally nothing he could say that's going to help at this point, honestly. I'm sure his fans who are still in the phase of really hoping that none of this is true, which is where I was at in the last video, are very much wanting him to say something like, just reassure us that it's not true. That that's not a wise thing for him to do from his perspective, because it's not going to help. And again, unless he can completely debunk these things, it's going to look like a lie, to be honest, given the weight of everything that's gone on. But we'll get into more of that as we go along. Quick reiterative thing about Tortoise Media itself. I've already hinted at the fact that I really thought they dropped the ball in their presentation. I do want to clarify one thing about this, though, because I saw some people coming out and attempting to defend to me the work, or the honor, I guess, of Tortoise Media and Paul Corona Galicia, who was one of the podcast hosts and the reporters. Interesting, nobody in my comments tried to defend Rachel Johnson, who's the other one, but some people did try and defend Tortoise Media and Paul Corona Galicia. And the thing that I want to be clear about is I don't think that they are bad investigators. I actually think the odds are at this point, they're pretty good, because they found, I think, pretty much all the information that was relevant that they could get a hold of. They found another woman, because the main thing that they started with was talking with the woman named Scarlett, who had been Gaiman's nanny. Again, I went over all that, but then they found Kay, a woman who had encounters as a fan with Gaiman back in the early 2000s. I need to give credit for their investigative work. I do actually think they are good investigators. However, journalism has two parts: investigation and reporting. And their reporting of what they found in their investigation, that is what left massive things to be desired. There were so many basic things not covered, glossed over, irrelevant information presented, unchallenged information. I went over all this in excruciating detail in the last one. I think they're good at investigation. I think they suck at actually reporting. This preamble is going on longer than I want. A couple of quick notes about some things that got brought up a fair bit in the comments of the last one that I didn't address in the video, that I'll touch on briefly, largely to explain why I didn't bring them up. One is, some people noted that according to the podcast, Gaiman's account was that Scarlett had some kind of condition that meant she could have false memories.
Neil Gaiman's account suggests we should treat Scarlett's allegations with caution, as they first surfaced when she was hospitalized, he says, for the treatment of a condition that's associated with false memories.
Now, I didn't bring that up for a couple of reasons. The first being, that was the only thing from the supposed Gaiman's account, which, again, if you haven't seen the other video, you really should. But if you haven't, was a very recurrent thing. They never quote Neil Gaiman directly, but they're constantly citing Gaiman's account and Gaiman's position. But of all the Gaiman's account and Gaiman's position statements, that one was the only one that contained, like, unsolicited information. Everything else was just a denial, was just a yes, that happened, but it was consensual. No, that didn't happen. No, that didn't happen at that time.
Neil Gaiman's position,
etc., etc., etc. The offering for the idea that she had some kind of mental condition was the one thing that was like, you didn't have to include that. And since at the time I had no clue where the Gaiman's position and Gaiman's account statements came from, because the podcast never frickin' said where they actually got that, I was not comfortable in putting that forward, especially because there actually is a moment that is very casual and has no attention drawn to it, where Scarlett actually uses the phrase "my delusion."
The messages are really hard for me to go through because of, my delusion, and I'm so furious with myself.
And I think it's likely that when she used that phrase, she was referring to her delusion in previously thinking that this wasn't harmful for her, this wasn't coercive, as she came to better understand what it was that happened to her. However, it was in there so randomly, I couldn't completely rule out the possibility that she thought she had some kind of mental condition, and maybe she had told Gaiman about that, and that's what the statement was referring to. I didn't know at the time. I opted just to leave it out. The other thing that I've seen crop up a bit in the discourse is the number 14, with this claim that Gaiman has done this with 14 other women. That is in the podcast. I didn't include it because it's one of the least verifiable statements. What I mean by that is there are whole swaths of the stuff with Scarlett that is all in WhatsApp messages, a WhatsApp history that she provided to Tortoise Media. And anything that was in the WhatsApp, they've got the exact words of what it was that happened. The number 14 comes only from Scarlett, and it's from her saying that when she talked to Amanda Palmer, Gaiman's wife at the time, about what had gone on, Amanda Palmer said that this has happened, or that said that Scarlett was the 14th woman this had happened with.
She said I was the 14th woman that had gone to her.
Now, the thing is, I didn't want to bring that up, partially because the podcast itself actually puts no emphasis on it. It just drops it in there. They probably didn't put emphasis because they had nothing to back it up. But again, the only source on this is Scarlett saying what Amanda Palmer was saying. And also, given the timing of things, it's distinctly possible that Palmer's response to that was not with the full understanding of what happened with Scarlett, because again, to reiterate as quickly as I can, this is going on longer than I want. But anyways, Scarlett initially had kind of just said, Gaiman made a pass at me, and Palmer's response was, I bet he did. And Scarlett says she went into more detail at that point, except we have the text exchange between Scarlett's friends Misma and Amanda Palmer later on, which is presented in a way that really makes it seem like Amanda Palmer is at least taking the position that prior to Misma going off on her, she did not understand the severities.
In her reply to Misma, Amanda says, I did not know much of this. It is horrifying. I understand what you have said, and I deeply appreciate you sharing it with me.
So even her saying this has happened with 13 other women, you're the 14th woman, it's distinctly possible that that was a response to the notion of he made a pass at me, not at all the other stuff that she alleged that he did. But again, it was weird, it was squirrely, there was a single source, and it wasn't even a claim that Scarlett was making, it was a claim that she was making that Amanda Palmer, who did make no comments for the thing, was claiming. That was a few steps attached, and I felt it better to leave it out. But I wanted to give context for it because, again, I see it cropping up in the discourse. Finally, a point of clarity that some people seem confused on. If you are one of the folks who's waiting for the courts to decide the outcome, you're going to be waiting forever. None of this is in court right now. None of these women tried to take him to court, civil court or criminal. Well, no, back up. One did. One woman, Scarlett, went to the police. That investigation did not move forward so far as can be told at this point with, the limited amount of information that the police in New Zealand are willing to give in regards to this whole thing. So there isn't going to be a court deciding as things presently stand. No suits have been filed, no charges have been made. So if you were kind of going with the admittedly kind of a cop-out thing of like, well, I'll wait and see what happens in court. It's not in court. And I was going to take time to address some people who came at me, possibly in good faith, but quite possibly in bad faith, accusing me of ageism. And when I brought up the power dynamic issues and specifically cited the age gap between Gaiman and these women, because in the podcast covered before, both the women were in their early 20s and Gaiman was either 40 or in his 60s at each of these various points in time. And I was going to push back on that, but you know what? I'm not going to. I'm spending too much time on this preamble anyway. I'm just going to point out that if you think the only thing I was pointing out about the power imbalance that was at play in there was the age gap, if you think that was the only thing I was pointing at and you're ignoring literally everything else I brought up, such as the amount of wealth, influence, the fact that he was literally the employer of one of these women, and how age was just one more factor in all of this, if that's what you think I was doing, I'm not wasting my time on you. I put a ton of context in there. The age is a messy thing. Age gaps are a complicated thing to talk about, but at no point did I say that the age gap alone is the problem. All right, let's get into this. We have two things to look at. A fifth episode in the Tortoise Media podcast series, Master, the allegations against Neil Gaiman. I hate that title so much. I talked about why before. And one episode of a podcast called Am I Broken, which I was not familiar with. We're going to start with the new episode from Tortoise Media because I already know what I'm dealing with going in with them. So I just kind of want to knock this out quickly. This is not going to be as exhaustive as what I went into on the previous video was, largely because the problems with this are the same kinds of problems that went on in the previous one. Questionable framing, a ton of weirdly worded Neil Gaiman's position statements, still not saying where the hell that came from. I do actually know where they got that now. Save it though, we'll come back to it. All the problems with the presentation are there again. Now, I went over those things a lot more thoroughly last time because it was important for me to establish a pattern and to show that any individual instance that I cited that were the problems with how that podcast presented, and again, to remind you and be very emphatic, problems with the presentation do not negate the facts of the matter, and I was pretty darn clear about the fact that while I have no reason to doubt these women, I don't trust this outlet. And I gave my reasons as to why. But there was a reason for me to go through everything and be really thorough to show that it was a pattern, it wasn't a mistake, it wasn't a one-off, it wasn't a goof. Because it's largely the same patterns here, I don't need to establish that again. Just believe me when I tell you most of the kind of stuff that I pointed out being a problem there is also a problem here. I'll cite some specific things that they do that's like, oh, for crying out loud, but for most of it, it's just in line with what they did before, and I don't feel like going through it beat for beat. That having been said, and for as much frustration as I have with Tortoise Media, these two new women who spoke with Tortoise and who are included in this new 5th episode of this podcast series, I do understand why they went to Tortoise. As much as I would have loved for them to go to somebody else, I understand why they went to Tortoise. Tortoise was the one who broke the story, and it has already proven that, regardless of how questionable I feel their presentation was, they are willing to present these women's stories. So if they felt it was important that their stories be added to the conversation, putting it into the hands of the people who started the conversation pretty much ensures that you're not going to be ignored and have your concerns in your story just dropped. So I get why they went there, as frustrating as I find this outlet. So the first of these two women is named Caroline Wallner, which immediately gives us a massive distinction between the allegations in the previous podcast, which is that she is giving both her first and last name. Now, even though she gave her full name, I'm not going to use any images of her. She's not a public figure, and I don't think giving her full name gives people the right to just invade her privacy more than she's already opened herself up for. If we hit a point where I would normally put up an image of the person, I'm going to put up a piece of pottery. Because as I will mention later, she is a ceramic artist and a potter. Previously, we had Scarlett, which we are led to believe that may well be her first name, but first name only was given. And there was Kay, who didn't even give a name, only gave an initial. But in terms of her coming forward, her giving her full name is a break from the things we've had before. I do want to emphasize that the previous women speaking under a sense of pseudo-anonymity, again, does not negate their stories, but it does say something about the strength of someone's convictions that they put their first and last name out there to potentially be harassed and pilloried by people who either want to defend Gaiman in specific or who enjoy going after women who say bad things about powerful men. Yeah, they're out there. Just these generic people who love to launch down your throat if you even suggest that a woman gives an accurate account of her experiences with a powerful man. They don't even have to be a fan of that man. Some of them will just do it. But her putting her first and last name out there is huge, actually. And it definitely just brings a different kind of weight to the things that she's saying. Now, the podcast proper opens with a statement that is intended to be listened to after the first 4, but despite that, there's a ton of filler in here, a ton of reiterated information from the previous 4 episodes. I suspect largely just to fill out the runtime and be sure that this hits a length that enables them to meet their requirements for sponsorships and ad placements. I can't prove that, but that is my very strong belief. It's nowhere near as egregious as, say, episode 3 was, which that episode was so much filler it shouldn't even have existed in the first place, but there is a decent amount of it here. Now, this episode has a very heavy focus on NDAs, which came up previously in regards to Scarlett because she had signed one. Now, they go over again with ominous music going on behind them, some details of NDAs in general and quoting specific parts of the NDA that she signed. It's all presented in a very fear-mongering sense.
From any and all claims, demands, liabilities, suits, debts, obligations, controversies, costs, expenses, accounts, damages, losses, or judgments of every kind or character, defences and causes of action arising in law or equity that claimants ever had, now have, or hereafter may have.
And again, as before, if you want to take objection to the very nature of NDAs, what they are and how they are frequently used, especially when it comes to people who are in some way employed by or otherwise encounter famous or rich people, yeah, there's plenty of criticisms to be made about those things. However, by and large, the NDAs that are quoted are pretty standard, at least as far as these things tend to go. What I will grant is there is a reason to bring up specifically the NDA that Wallner signed, because it is the one piece of her story that has concrete evidence of. And what I mean by that is when Scarlett told her story, there was the concrete evidence of the WhatsApp messages. No matter what you think about what she said or how much you believe about her own words when she spoke in interviews, the WhatsApp messages are what they are, as were any email correspondence. In the case of Wallner, it's pretty much just the NDA. Pretty much everything else that you hear, other than, the obligatory Neil Gaiman's position statements.
Neil Gaiman's position
are Colleen's word on what it was that happened. That was kind of the case with Kay, which is probably why they presented Kay secondarily and Scarlett primarily, because there was more concrete stuff. So my point being, the NDAs are worth bringing up, although not necessarily presenting them the way that they do in this, because that is the one fully tangible thing. It can be looked at. What did she sign? What did she agree to? The other thing that actually makes her a unique case compared to the other women that have come forward, both previously and the other ones that I'm going to be talking about later in this video, is that she is not in her 20s. She is actually about the same age as Gaiman. And that makes this a bit different. And we'll get into the specifics later, but I would say that this entire series of events come across more as opportunistic than predatory. That's not me declaratively saying that he was being outright predatory and hunting for 20-somethings in the previous situations. However, I see how someone could arrive at that conclusion. I'm not saying I am coming at that conclusion. Again, I'll get to my own thoughts at the back end of this, but the general overall feel of this is that this was something that happened because he had the opportunity, not necessarily because he was seeking it out. What is the opportunity? Okay, so Wallner is a ceramic artist. She lives in upstate New York. She and, at the time, her husband and 3 daughters who were living with them, they met Neil Gaiman and Amanda Palmer in 2014 when the two of them were kind of their neighbors. They were residing in a house. Now, a little bit later, Gaiman and Palmer would buy a home in Woodstock, New York. At the time, Gaiman was teaching at Bard College. Now, the thing was, despite there being a reason for them to buy this very large property in the area, the reality was he had book tours and other stuff, and Amanda Palmer was frequently touring with her music. There were going to be long stretches of time when no one was in the house. And so on that basis, they moved Wallner and her husband and her kids onto the property, onto a 5-acre portion of the property, which should give you an idea of how big this whole thing was, given that they were given just 5 acres for themselves. And there was a home built for them there, and they were to caretake whenever Palmer and Gaiman were not around. So that was the arrangement, that they would be given a place to live rent-free in exchange for taking care of the entire property. Now, none of this was on paper. There were no formal contracts. This was all handshakes and verbal agreements, which are a form of contract and can be defended in court. But overall, just a general thing, don't get into a situation like this without a contract. I don't care if it's your friend. I don't care if it's your family. Get a contract. It's not there because you don't trust the other person. It's there as a safety net because you never know what the future is going to hold. Get stuff in writing. Crying out loud. Anyways, so this living situation continued on for a while, and then in 2017, Wallner and her husband split. Now, I do want to be pretty clear about this, because this feeds into what I said before about this seeming to be more of an issue of opportunism rather than intent, because there is nothing said. We don't get details on why they split. We don't know what the tension was, if there was a single fight or if things had just been falling apart for a while. We don't know exactly what happened, but there is nothing said to indicate that Gaiman or that situation was in any way involved in the split between Wallner and her husband. And I want to be emphatic about that because I don't want anyone to even have the wiggle room to be all conspiratorial, like, I bet he broke them up so he could get to her. No, there's zero indication of that. However, once the split happened, Gaiman decided that between the two of them, he was going to side with Caroline. And as a result, he fired her husband, and she stayed on basically in the exact same arrangement. And she says very openly that he was kind and supportive to her through a hard time as her split was happening.
That's when Neil was really, really nice to me. He was really kind.
Things kind of came to a head a little bit later when he came back from a trip to Australia, and he invites her into the sauna with him. And this is probably ringing some bells for people who remember his invitation of Scarlett into an outdoor bath. But in this case, they go into the sauna together. There is kissing, there is groping, and at this point, Caroline, out of some degree of concern that this is going to cause a problem for Gaiman.
And I said, what would Amanda say about this? And he said, about what? And I said, about this romance. That's what's embarrassing. And he said, Caroline, there is no romance.
And that was where things really started to fracture. Because up to that point, by her account, she was at least leaning reciprocal. She was feeling closer to him. But he made clear at that point, actually, I don't have romantic feelings for you. But he was still groping her, physical petting, making out, what have you. Now, in a way, in a vacuum, devoid of the other context, we are going to bring that context back. But in a vacuum, one could almost see a nobility in that. Like once she brings up the idea that this is an actual emotional connection, that he goes, no, that's not what this is. There's a nobility to that clarity of not stringing her along, of not letting her think that this is something that it isn't. That's devoid of context. We need to bring the context back in because the context is she's living on his property in a house that she has no written legal rights to. And that's where everything goes to hell. Because from here on out, he would go to her, and I'm not going to go into details of the specific acts involved. If you want to know, you can listen to the podcast. I don't recommend it, but you can. I don't think the particular specifics of the details are what matters here. What matters is they would continue to have encounters, and he would be intermittently reminding her, we might need the house back. Or sometimes he'd frame it as Amanda's talking about wanting the house back.
Or he would say, Amanda really wants the house back and she wants your studios. And then he would grab my hand and say, but you take care of me and I'll take care of you.
In other words, whether he did this deliberately or not, and again, you can have your debates over how much he knew what he was doing, how much he understood the power dynamics. Again, I'll address this on the back end. But the reality of the situation is that she believes and feels very strongly that if he is not happy with her, it's going to cost her her home. She is not going to have someplace to live. And that creates an unethical power imbalance. Even if he never said explicitly, and she never says that he does. It's unfortunately, with the way that it's cut together, slightly vague as to whether, because she does say sometimes she would say no, or he'd asked her to come to the house and she wouldn't. And she says, then he'd be like, it might be time for us to take the house back. It's not entirely clear from her telling whether he would do that in immediate response to her turning him down, or if it's something that would be brought up later, or if it was just something that was constantly in the air, because he would mention it intermittently. How directly connected, his request for sex and reminding her of that were like temporally, I don't know. That's not made very clear in the presentation of this. But regardless, even if he's not specifically saying it, back to back and making that nearly explicit, that's still the reality of the situation. She doesn't feel it is safe for her to turn down his advances consistently because it could cost her her home. And again, when I say unsafe, I mean specifically in regards to what she will lose, which is the house. As with the other women we've had before, and as with the ones who we will be discussing later, there isn't really a discussion of physical violence, of physical restraint, or of forcing himself on her. This is a matter of coercion. And again, a situation that he did not create, but he did exploit. He took opportunity of a woman that was on his property and was dependent on him, not by his design, but by happenstance, and he opted to take advantage of that. And again, even if he himself did not understand that power dynamic, she absolutely felt, and she says this explicitly, she felt she couldn't turn him down.
And he can say it was consensual, but why would I do that? You know, it was because I was scared of losing my place. You know, it's all I had right then.
And it's things like this that are the exact reason why it is at best dubiously ethical, if not completely unethical, for employees to have affairs with their bosses, or, you know, word it the other way around if you prefer, for prisoners to have affairs with prison guards or anything like that. The very nature of the inherent power structure is such that, frankly, even if someone vocally says, yes, I consent, the circumstances that they are in make that consent dubious at best, because it is extremely plausible for people in situations like that to feel that the only thing they can do is say yes because of the circumstances that they're in. They don't have to be explicitly threatened. It's just the nature of the situation that they found themselves in. So this went on for about 2 years, and Gaiman's position...
Neil Gaiman's position
is that it was consensual and actually initiated by Caroline Wallner. So that's his camp's take on this whole thing. Things sort of ended in early 2020 when he went out of state, and then the lockdown started happening. So he wasn't going to come back for a very long time, but he was still in communication with her through video calls primarily, and occasionally sending pictures, and he would ask her to send ones back. There isn't really a lot of details about the pictures or if he asked her to do specific things in the pictures that he wanted to send back. However, she does say it was not uncommon in his video calls for him to be in the shower, touching himself. She does not explicitly say whether or not she reciprocated these at all. The tone would seem to imply that she just basically was a passive recipient of these video calls. He would call her, she would pick up, he would do what he felt like doing, and she would be on the call, and that because that's what he would enjoy about it. And it's possible she may have been a more active participant. That's not stated, and ultimately doesn't really matter. There is a moment here where I'm going to point something out that Tortoise Media did. They mention at this point that they found and spoke with 2 other women who are not named and whose stories are not part of this overall thing, but who corroborated having similar video call experiences with Gaiman.
Caroline's descriptions of Neil Gaiman's behavior on these calls matches descriptions of sexual calls he made to 2 other women we have spoken to, and who do not feature in this episode because they spoke only to provide what they say was corroborating material.
Now, given all the other nonsense that this podcast has pulled, you might be expecting me to call this out. I'm actually not. This is actually relevant. And it's not uncommon in a story like this where you're trying to get multiple sources and get sources to verify and back up that some of them are going to want to remain anonymous and don't want their story to actually become part of the narrative, but who are willing to confirm, yes, I had a similar experience to that. Now, things only really get dicey when you hinge your entire reporting around things like that. There are still ways in which you can make that work as if you're a good journalist, which, but the inclusion of these is actually warranted. These 2 women, although I would have liked to have known how they found them, you know, whether these were women who got into contact with Tortoise Media like Caroline did, and also like the woman we're going to talk about in a little bit, Julia, or if these were people that Tortoise Media found who they knew had some relationship with Gaiman, but this was all they were willing to share. I would have like to have known that, but ultimately that doesn't make or break this inclusion. It is actually relevant to point out that these kinds of calls are a pattern with him, verified by other people, even if those other people do not want to give further details of what their relationship or encounters with him were like. This is supporting evidence, and it's fine to include it because in this case, unlike a lot of the other stuff that they included, especially in the previous batch of podcasts, it's actually relevant. Now, according to Wallner, in 2021, she stopped responding to his calls and his other contacts, and then was informed later that year that she would have to vacate the house by December. So certainly the sequence of events would lead one to take the implication that this was in response to her no longer indulging and partaking in the things he wanted to do. That's not stated explicitly. It's not even really made as a strong implication, but that is, by the order of events that they're putting forward, implied. Not just implied by Tortoise Media. They've done this thing where they put things in a certain order to imply something that maybe they shouldn't be. I'd actually say this is one of the more fair times as far as that goes. It's not actually totally clear if Gaiman himself was actually the one who told her she had to move out, or if that was done through representatives or lawyers. Like, the phrase, he told her that she would have to leave, is used, but that's not said by Caroline Wallner. That's said by Paul Corona Galicia as part of a summation portion. So I don't know. According to the podcast, Neil Gaiman's account of this, it acknowledges that Caroline did live on the property. It acknowledges that she lived there rent-free, and it acknowledges that she was asked to vacate the property at a certain point. It also acknowledges that the relationship happened, but as mentioned before, insists that it was consensual. It does not acknowledge that she was effectively an employee as a caretaker. That part goes unacknowledged. Additionally, I'm just going to call them the phone sex calls, are also not really acknowledged by Gaiman's position.
Neil Gaiman's position.
But again, even if he believes that this was consensual, and he might, the nature of the power imbalance is pretty much irreconcilable. Like, as I said before, she thinks that if this man's unhappy with her, she's going to lose her house. Just the fact of that situation, you really can't fix that. Caroline Wallner says that she had a difficult time trying to find another home because, if you aren't aware, that area of upstate New York is actually pretty damned expensive. And she was having a very difficult time finding something that she could afford that didn't require her to move a very significant distance. So she asked for more time. And when it was not initially granted, that was apparently the point at which she brought up what had gone on between her and Gaiman. And at that point, she was offered a settlement so long as she signed an NDA. Now, this is an important deviation from what happened with Scarlett and her NDA. In that case, despite the work of the podcast to lean into and let sit the implication, or actually Scarlett's open statement that she was required to sign the NDA in order to get her rent covered for a chunk of time, that actually was never present in the actual correspondence that were read on that podcast. In this case, it is clear, because we have the NDAs and we know what was signed, that it was conditional. For her to get a settlement, she had to sign it. That was explicit, not implied. And in Scarlett's case, that had been an implication. She went ahead and signed it on the basis of that implication, but it wasn't explicit there. It is here. So now, continuing my frustration with this podcast, it's not entirely clear how the subject of the sexual encounters that she'd had with Gaiman came up in the course of these negotiations. Like, I don't know whether she actually put it forward on the table as like a leverage point in negotiations, or if it was something that came up in the course of her conversations, like she could have just been listing stuff that was adding to her stress that was making this hard for her when she was just asking for more time initially. And then the lawyer heard that and went, oh, that's not good. We should button that up real quick, in legal terms. I don't know which it is, because we don't get Caroline's exact words for what went down. We get a summation from Paul Corona Galicia saying that this is effectively what happened. I'd love to know more details about how that came up. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter, but I would have liked to have known. So this brings in the subject of money. And this is going to be relevant mostly for the kinds of people who tend to just knee-jerkingly defend men in power who are accused of this kind of stuff. The fact that she was paid money for some people will be used against her, which I think, especially in this particular case, is unfair. You need to realize that she was going to lose her house. No matter what, she was losing her house. And so this money wasn't, a luxury. She wasn't going to take this and take a cruise around the world. She needed a financial cushion so that she would not suddenly be homeless. The podcast doesn't actually cover whether or not her daughters were still living with her at this point. I ran the math on the timeline because Caroline does say later on that she came forward after hearing the previous podcast, and one of the things she noted was her daughters were the age of Scarlett and Kay, which would put them in their 20s, meaning they are most likely out of the house, at college, first apartment, what have you. So I don't think she also had to worry about her daughters ending up without a home, but, it is also distinctly possible that even in their 20s, some of them were still living at home. That's just not ever made explicit at any point in either direction. But regardless, it is definitely a fact that she was losing her home and she needed finances to land somewhere and be okay. The initial settlement that she was offered was $5,000. She came back with a counter offer of $300,000 on the basis of the loss of the property, her trauma from the experiences with Gaiman, and the ongoing expense of therapy. Ultimately, this was settled for $275,000 on the condition that she signed a pretty thorough NDA. Now, in the course of this, Tortoise Media drops a detail that, I wouldn't have included because it's needlessly salacious and kind of biasing and also completely irrelevant. But they did anyways, and I want to point out that this was an instance, one of the more egregious instances of their nonsense seeping in and poisoning the well on this, which is that they named the lawyer that represented Gaiman in these proceedings and in this settlement. So if you are a connoisseur of celebrity scandal, you might be familiar with the name Andrew Brettler. His past client list includes such embattled names as Armie Hammer, Chris Noth, Bryan Singer, Danny Masterson, Russell Brand, and Prince Andrew. Now, it's worth emphasizing right now, Brettler is a litigator. He's not a criminal defense attorney. So like in the case of, say, Danny Masterson, he was handling a civil harassment case against Masterson. The criminal case that he was convicted on, Brettler had nothing to do with. He's not that kind of lawyer. But the reason I point out that it's kind of nonsense that Tortoise Media brought this up is that if you know anything about this, and they don't list a complete client list, they don't even list one as long as I did, but they do list a few choice names such as Prince Andrew and Russell Brand. And by doing that, just kind of seeks to taint Gaiman by association. Like, oh, he brought in this lawyer who's also represented these scumbags. Oh.
Andrew Brettler, who has acted for Russell Brand, Danny Masterson, and Prince Andrew, represented Neil Gaiman in this case.
Like, oh, stop the presses. A wealthy and well-known individual hired a lawyer who specializes in these kinds of cases for wealthy and well-known individuals. Wow. Look, I'm not saying this to defend Brettler. The guy kind of gives me Scuzz vibes, but that's just the nature of his job at the end of the day. And bringing up specifically who he was has no bearing on literally anything. And they did it anyway, because it's Tortoise Media, and that's just what they do. And so we get into some of the details of the NDA. Now, again, like the previous one with Scarlett, a lot of this is pretty standard, but there is one very specific thing that is pretty relevant, which is that the NDA very specifically bars Wallner from ever bringing her allegations to a court or tribunal of any kind. Now, it's worth noting at this point that in New York State, where all this went down, NDAs that in any way frustrate official investigations or proceedings are voided. So there is a very high percentage that this thing would not hold up in court for a frickin' second. It has been proven over and over and over again, particularly in the state of New York, that these things get voided very, very quickly. And so you might find yourself asking, well, why did a lawyer, if he's any good that he keeps getting hired by all these people, put forward an NDA that's not going to stand up to scrutiny? Well, because NDAs kind of come in two flavors. Well, three if you want to count the combination of them. But there's NDAs that are worded in a specific way to hold up in court so that they are truly, properly, legally binding. And then there are NDAs that are worded in such a way that actually probably won't hold up in court and that are unenforceable, but they're still silencing. Because, yeah, there's a very good chance that this NDA would be voided by a court if it actually showed up there and was challenged. But the thing is, Caroline Wallner doesn't know that. So she just sees this list of things that she's not allowed to say. And because she's not a lawyer, she's going to be silenced by that. We have the evidence of that because Tortoise Media actually talked to a couple of her friends who said that she would talk to them sometimes about, what she had gone through because she was still going to therapy, still trying to work through everything that she'd experienced. And they said at a certain point, she very specifically stopped talking about this, which is a time that lines up with when she would have signed the NDA. So we know it had the intended silencing effect. And we also know that after she heard the previous episodes of this podcast, Caroline consulted a lawyer on whether or not this NDA was something that would hold up in court. They don't really go into detail about what exactly she was told by the lawyer, but the implication is certainly that she, after consulting that lawyer, felt confident enough to come forward and go on the record. Now, in case you're wondering about the money, she broke the NDA, doesn't she lose the money? I doubt that's going to get challenged for a couple of reasons. The first is that would immediately put the NDA itself up for scrutiny in courts. And like I said, I doubt it would hold up. Understand I'm not a lawyer, but to my understanding, I don't think that it would hold up and it would just end up voided. But also be aware that, so far as I understand it, voiding the NDA wouldn't void the contract that paid her for signing the NDA. So the NDA getting voided doesn't mean that she suddenly has to pay the money back necessarily. And I think the other reason why this probably isn't going to be challenged anyway is, kind of the Streisand effect. You bring more attention to it. And also it's just going to come across as petty retribution, which isn't a good look for a guy who right now seems very much to be trying to hide and wait for this all to blow over. So yeah, I don't think that's going to happen. Now, that's not to say that she is doing this risk-free, but she makes it very clear that if there is risk involved, she is accepting it. She says flat out the reason why she's giving her full name.
I thought seriously about whether or not to use my name. When I understood that fear and shame were the feelings that kept rising, I realized this is part of the problem. It doesn't belong to me, to us.
Whether there ultimately are legal consequences for her for this or not, I don't know, but she seems to be fully aware that there might be. I doubt there will be, but there might be, there could be. And she went forward anyways. Now, Caroline Wallner's account does take up the bulk of this podcast. There is also an account from another woman that is much shorter, so hopefully we can get through it quickly. So this brings us to the other woman that's included in this new podcast. Her name is Julia Hobsbawm. She's a UK-based writer and public speaker who has known Gaiman for over 40 years and does use the term friend to describe him. Now, unlike Colleen, I am comfortable using some images of Julia because as a public speaker, she actually is somewhat of a public figure. Hobsbawm's account it's honestly not much more than an anecdote. However, I'm not going to bemoan Tortoise Media for including it for kind of the same reason I didn't get on their case about including the two women who kind of backed up the story of the kind of things that he tends to do over video calls, which is, it is part of an overall pattern that is being established at this point. Now, Hobsbawm's particular story is, I would go with the least dramatic in terms of what is claimed and alleged, but it does fit into the overall picture that is currently being built as more and more people come forward. So it is relevant. It's not load-bearing, but they also don't present it like it is. It takes up far less time, and they treat it as the supporting piece of evidence that it is. So she was working in publishing in 1986, and she was 22, Gaiman was 25, and at that time he was still married to his first wife. They were acquaintances, friendly acquaintances, and there was one evening, Hobsbawm says she doesn't really remember exactly how it was that Gaiman ended up at her place, but that for her, romance between her and him had never been in the cards. I'm contrasting this with, say, Caroline Wallner, who said she had felt to those kinds of feelings for him before he shut that down, but then continued to pursue her sexually anyways. For Julia Hobsbawm, she says, I never had those feelings for him, and she assumed he didn't have them for her either. But on this evening, apparently, he made what she describes as...
He just went from 0 to 90. I mean, I remembered he made an aggressive, unwanted pass at me out of the blue that I've never experienced before or since.
Now, we don't get a ton of details, but at some point in this, he pushed her onto the couch and she said no, pushed him away, and following that, he left. This is basically the entirety of the encounter, but it's still included partially because Julia Hobsbawm wanted it to be. And honestly, I do think it is relevant because it is not identical to the pattern we would see later, but it does feel like in many ways like a precursor to it. He made a move and was stopped, but he just plowed ahead and waited to see if he was stopped. And there we do apparently have Gaiman's account of this.
Neil Gaiman's account is that he attempted a kiss. Upon realising he had misread the situation and that Julia was not receptive, he stopped the attempt. His position is, it was no more than a young man misreading a situation.
I'm sure from his perspective that's probably accurate, but the thing is, that's effectively the same thing that he would continue to do later on. Either misread or project onto someone this energy of this reading and think that this was something that would be wanted, move ahead, but then unlike Julia, the stories from other women that we've heard was that they didn't say no. But that points to the change in power dynamics because back in 86, Neil Gaiman wasn't Neil Gaiman. He wasn't a big name in publishing. She wasn't a fan of his. That wasn't the nature of the dynamic. There wasn't an inherent power imbalance, unlike the other stories that we hear. Because in the case of fans, if this is someone that they adore and they have so much of their own worth wrapped up in the idea that this person has allowed them into their life, the threat there, the inherent threat of that situation is that if this person is unhappy with me, they could revoke my access to them. And if you are a fan of someone in that kind of put them on a pedestal way, that the nature of that dynamic is deeply imbalanced because you're going to be disinclined to do anything other than what it is you think they want because you know if they are not happy with you, you don't get to be around them anymore. And then we have much more explicit power imbalances, like with Caroline Wallner and the housing situation, or like with Scarlett being the nanny. I don't remember whether or not I pointed this out in the video. I think I ended up pointing it out in some comment replies. For the record, it doesn't matter if Scarlett was strictly speaking the employee of Amanda Palmer or of Neil Gaiman. Whichever one was the one who she believed to be her employer is irrelevant because Gaiman was still the client, and the client holds similar power in terms of if he's unhappy, I lose my job. That dynamic still remains even if the employer was technically Amanda Palmer, which it's actually never really clarified in that earlier reporting whether or not it was, or whether it was Gaiman. But the relevance of Julia Hobsbawm's story is, again, that it feels very much like the nascent version of this pattern that fits the other stories that we have been told. And if you're going to be very generous and say that Gaiman does not understand how the power dynamics are different, if this was established in his early 20s, just how he moves forward, as those power dynamics tilted more and more and more in his favor, it resulted in women who felt that they couldn't say no, and it wasn't until being told no that he was going to stop. This was why I went on a whole tangent in the previous video about the importance of enthusiastic consent. It's not enough to wait for a no. Saying no means no is not enough. Nothing means yes other than yes. The only way anything can mean yes besides yes is if you actually have a dynamic that you've established with someone through good communication so you know what your boundaries are. But until you've set that kind of dynamic up with clear boundaries and rules and safe words and everything else, nothing means yes but yes. Having said that, it is worth reiterating this particular encounter with Julia Hobsbawm was back in 1986, where just no means no was kind of, I don't know how old that phrase actually is, but certainly in terms of being pushed in the pop culture, it would have felt fairly recent. And it probably would have been viewed by a lot of people at the time as rather progressive that he stopped when told no. That's the sad reality. Doesn't make anything that he did okay, but it would be disingenuous not to acknowledge that in 86, you can't project the same level of expectation that he should have understood that it wasn't okay back then as you can now. Again, not to negate or excuse anything, but just being honest about the culture and the environment at the time. The thing that really struck me about Julia's story was that she has taken on an awful lot of guilt with the fact that she didn't say more to him after that she didn't explicitly tell him why it wasn't okay what he did.
I do wish that I had not enabled the celebrity part of him without having said to him at least once, hey, come on, what happened back then? I let it lie. And now I really regret that.
Hey folks, it's Vera from The Edit. I need to add something in here because in putting this together, I caught something that I hadn't put down in my notes and had forgotten, but I need to bring up now. It isn't actually Julia Hobsbawm specifically who says that maybe if I'd done this differently or addressed this earlier, maybe it would have stopped him from hurting other women. That is actually said by Rachel Johnson. Now, she says it in a way as if she is summarizing and expressing what Julia is saying.
She now thinks that had she called him out on it at the time, in 1986, she could have stopped what could be described as a pattern of behaviour in its tracks. She says she is plagued by the incident to this day and worries that she enabled his alleged misconduct to continue.
And if that's what Julia actually thinks, I really would have liked to have heard that from her. The clip I played of her does lean in that direction, but it does not go as far as what Rachel Johnson says. And the reason I need to bring up is because of what gets added in right after the clip I played for you earlier. Let's go and listen to the end, and then I'll let it keep playing.
I let it lie. And now I really regret that.
It's a thought.
It's a thought. Now, once I cut back to what I originally shot, you're going to hear me explain why the very idea that Julia would assess or assign to herself any amount of guilt for what Gaiman would later do is understandable, but incorrect. So you're going to hear my thoughts on that in a minute, but understand, that is wrong. And even if Rachel Johnson's assessment and summation of Julia Hobsbawm's feelings is accurate to how she actually feels about it, adding in it's a thought as if reinforcing that it would be correct, that if she had done something earlier, if she'd said something, that maybe none of this would have happened. That is fundamentally messed up. How dare you imply that the person who had to push somebody away and keep that person off of them is somehow responsible for that individual's later actions? How dare you even imply that that is the case, much less state it as her opinion? And even if it is accurate that that is how Julia feels, I don't care. It's a thought thing at the end. I cannot even begin to express how angry I am that they put that in there. I am now going to address directly Rachel Johnson, who said that, and Tortoise Media, who put it in the podcast. I say this with all sincerity. Fuck you. We now return you to your regularly scheduled ramble, already in progress. As a reminder, this is me picking up on the thought that Julia is holding guilt. So, back to it. And that was really sad to hear, because that's a really easy trap to get caught up into. It's no one person's responsibility to fix another person or divert them from a path. And the simple truth is that even if she had, odds are it wouldn't have made a difference. Now, that's not to say that it's not a conversation that she could have had or it wouldn't have benefited, but honestly, by itself, it probably wouldn't have changed him. Enough people over time, and not even necessarily the women he was pursuing, but people who witnessed his behavior, enough people telling him early on, that might have made a difference. But it's not her fault, but she assumes guilt all the same, which I think says a lot about the culture, both at the time in the 80s and even now. This idea that somehow men can't help themselves and it falls on the shoulders of other people to educate them or fix them or stop them. Men have more agency than that. Despite the narratives of certain types of people, men are not slaves to their desires. They make choices, and they are accountable to those choices. No one else is. Okay, so let's move on to the other podcast that came out. It was an episode of a podcast series called Am I Broken? Now, the nature of this podcast is completely different from Tortoise Media. This is hosted by a person called Papillon DeBoer. Now, DeBoer hosts this thing and is not a journalist. They don't claim to be a journalist. They don't present themselves as journalists. None of this is investigative. The nature of the podcast is to give people, generally women or female identifying people just by sheer numbers, but to give people who have been through situations like this a platform to voice their stories, not even necessarily with the intent of taking down their abusers. I browsed through the back catalog. Granted, I didn't go through everything, but I went as far into them as it took for DeBoer to mention Neil Gaiman by name in this episode of the podcast, and they weren't mentioning other people's names. I don't think the names of the abusers is normally a part of this format. It is here because the woman in question, who goes by the pseudonym Claire, she wanted to be sure that specifically it was known that this was the person who did this to her, in the hope of A, making it safe for other people to come forward, and B, hoping to prevent future issues and future harm. But the nature of this podcast isn't really about pointing and go, this person did something bad. It's just about platforming the survivors, which makes analyzing it a completely different can of worms than anything from Tortoise Media. Honestly, that's best exemplified by how long the stretches of the alleged victims speaking even are. In the case of Tortoise Media, the stretches for how long Kay, Scarlett, Caroline, Julia, how long they speak ranges 5 to maybe 20 seconds on the long end. That's not the case here. Claire talks uninterrupted for minutes at a time. This is not about shaping her story to a greater narrative. This is just about letting her tell her story. And in terms of the intents of this podcast, its intent is just to give people a platform. And I think it does that very well. Trying to analyze it in regards to allegations, it gets trickier because it's simply not trying to be what Tortoise Media is trying to be. There's a lot that I can look at Tortoise Media in terms of the presentation, how that biases things, bringing in outside information that doesn't matter. Pretty much none of that comes into play with Am I Broken? Because that's just not what it's doing. And there's good and bad things about that, at least for my purposes. I think as a product, it's a hell of a lot more defensible than Tortoise Media. But overall, for my purposes in terms of going through all this, it kind of puts me in a, well, what's the downside of what I'm listening to situation? Because in the case of Tortoise Media, I can very well believe the accounts by these women, and by and large I do. But the thing is that ultimately I have to take that as filtered through Tortoise Media, who is breaking them up and dividing them and putting into tiny clips and doing summations and doing all this outside stuff that often muddied the waters. So I don't know how well they present these women's actual stories so much as present a story that these women's accounts fit into. Whereas with Am I Broken, pretty much all it provides is the woman's account, is Claire's account. And while that means I don't have to have concerns about whether or not this podcast presentation is diluting or twisting or misframing what she's saying, it also is lacking all of the investigative work that Tortoise did. And as I said before, Tortoise sucks at presentation. They suck at reporting what they found out, but they are good at investigating, and they do investigate things that should be investigated. They do find the relevant information. And that additional context is completely absent. Part of why this matters is, remember how I said earlier on that I didn't bring up the idea that Scarlett was the 14th woman in the previous video because the only source for that was Scarlett herself, and in a situation where so much other stuff had so much evidence, that really supported as being very clearly this or that. And that was a very unsupported statement because it wasn't even something Scarlett was claiming. She claimed that Amanda claimed it. That kind of issue is the entirety of Claire's account. Because again, since it's not trying to be an investigative journalism piece, it's not providing any additional context, no timeline, no nothing, just Claire's story. Now again, as with the other women, I don't have reason to doubt Claire's story. But it is worth pointing out that the only thing we have from this is her memory and her perspective. And I don't say those to try and bring doubt to either of those things. However, strictly speaking, when it comes to getting the best understanding we can, it is easier to feel comfortable in making a determination of authenticity when, in addition to somebody's perspective and memory that they are offering, which, again, I'm not saying this trying to cast out, but are inherently fallible, because human beings are fallible. We have faulty memories. We have faulty perceptions. We just do. That doesn't excuse anybody, and it doesn't mean anybody is lying. But that is the nature of eyewitness accounts. So the more concrete facts you can bring in, as Tortoise would do with the WhatsApp message history, with emails, with corroborating witnesses who give very similar accounts so that it's not just one person's voice, to the details of the NDA, that stuff all bolsters the story and helps solidify the underlying truth of the perception and the memories of the women being told. It doesn't negate their stories if those things aren't present, but it does strengthen them if they are. And in the case of Claire's story, they just aren't there. That is just the reality of this podcast. Now, again, that's not a criticism. The podcast's not trying to do that, but it is the nature of the beast. So, having said that, let's talk about Claire's story. Claire's story bears an awful lot of similarities to that of Kay, who was the second woman in the initial batch of podcasts that we got. Kay met Gaiman in Florida at a book signing and was a fan of his work. Claire, similarly, was in her early 20s. Gaiman was in his 50s at the time, which would make this as happening between what happened with Kay and what happened with Scarlett. Claire's account is that she met Gaiman while he was touring with the podcast The Moth, and she met him at a book signing, and he then invited her to come to later stops on the tours. He gave her a VIP pass, and he brought her backstage to have things like have a poster signed by the cast, and then at the later stops on the tour, he invited her to the after party. Now, to her, this is her literary idol. Like so many people, she really admired his work. It meant a lot to her, and the idea that she could be close to him was deeply meaningful, and it meant a lot, just that very idea. That having been said, when he started doing things like trying to kiss her or putting a hand on her shoulder, it didn't feel completely right to her.
And so he was like touching me a lot, and it was really gross, but it was also great because I was with Neil Gaiman.
But she didn't say anything because in the back of her mind, if she objected, this would all end.
He was always really sweet, and there was always something kind of sexual about the messages, like usually like talking about the kiss or how good a kisser I was and how next time he saw me, we could do that more. And I was like, yes, that would be great. It was awesome. I had such a good time. Can't wait to do that again. Da da da. Didn't mean any of it. Said it anyway. I don't know. Because I knew if I stopped, then he would stop talking to me. Like I knew that, really.
So since their initial meeting and they begin having these early sort of making out things, he is in contact with her through Skype, through email. It's unclear whether or not she provided these things to DeBoer. I doubt it, again, just given the fact that this podcast is not journalistic in nature or presentation. But she describes phone sex calls with him, which bear a pretty close resemblance to the video calls that Caroline Wallner described over on the Tortoise Media podcast. And over time, eventually, he invites her to Nashville to a gathering and an after party, and to see, I believe it was a library that he either had on his property or it was a library he owned. Something about a library in Nashville. I wasn't 100% clear on that. So under that situation, she felt uncomfortable enough that when she went to the after party with some other young women, she came up with a signal that she would give them to be like, hey, could you come and, help me have an excuse to step away? Apparently, those young women either forgot it or in the course of the evening got too drunk to notice when it was given. And eventually on the tour bus, Claire found herself in the back with Gaiman, and he said things like, kiss me like you mean it, kiss me like you'll never see me again. Now, whether, assuming this account is accurate, whether he intended a statement like that or not to read like, if you don't kiss me well enough, you will never see me again, doesn't really matter, because that is how it processed into Claire's head because of the situation she was in. Again, her fear and her inability to say no, even though she never really said yes, her inability to say no was rooted in the idea of, I will lose this connection to this person I admire if he's not happy with me. That's how she describes it. That's how she talks about it. All this is going down in 2012. And interestingly, Claire actually mentions that she did get in touch with the Am I Broken podcast and DeBoer earlier. She got in touch with them in 2022, but she subsequently backed out of it for a couple of reasons. First of all, part of how she ended up getting in touch with DeBoer was that she had gone to some other outlets as over time she came to a better understanding of how damaging this had been with her. That's another recurrent thing, that many of these women have needed time and distance to properly process what it was that happened. And a lot of this might be cultural. One of the things Claire talks about pretty explicitly is,
but he hadn't raped me, and at that point, no one else had come forward.
And because of her understanding and the general cultural perception was, that's what we have to watch out for. That's what we report.
That was back in 2019 that I first tried to share my story. And I reached out to a handful of journalists, and I had several conversations off the record. But yeah, that message I got across the board was pretty much that what happened to me wasn't enough to establish a pattern of behavior, because I was just one person. And back then, everyone was looking for serial rapists, right? Like, not one-off creeps.
She was left in this place of deep uncertainty for a very long time. Apparently, the steps she took that made her firmly come to believe that she had been manipulated, she had been abused, because emotional and mental abuse are still abuse. Abuse need not be physical alone, or even physical at all. But regardless, what she actually did was she recorded a session she had with her therapist and then played it back to listen to it as if she was listening to someone else.
Because I hadn't listened to that recording like I was some judge or jury, and I wasn't looking for evidence for court or language to make the story all tidy and neatly summarized. And I was just listening to this girl who'd been deeply hurt by someone who had absolutely known better.
We actually do hear some portions of this therapy session. The permission was granted from the therapist to share this on the podcast. And yeah, it's a tough listen. And I'm not going to go into extreme detail about it, but that general sense of he wants these things, including some specific acts that are not described as being as BDSM or as physically harsh as, say, the stuff said by Scarlett, but are things that Claire says flat out, I don't even like that, like as a thing at all, but I let him do it anyway.
And then he put his tongue in my ear, and it was really gross, and I don't even like that with anybody. I did it anyway.
Now, I mentioned Claire had gotten in touch with DeBoer and the Am I Broken podcast in 2022, considering talking to them about this, because she'd gone to other outlets and they turned her down because, well, that same reason that sent her into a state of not knowing how to process. It wasn't rape and it wasn't physical violence. If it wasn't that big and she was the only one coming forward to these outlets, that's a lot for them to roll the dice and publish. And you can feel that that is self-serving or protective of Gaiman. I think that's a deeply inaccurate thing. Self-serving maybe, but only insofar as if an outlet is respectable and is going to publish something like that, they're really going to want to know that it's going to be worth the bother. And by bother, I mean potential legal threats from someone like Gaiman. So if they're going to put this out there, knowing that it's going to make a big enough splash on top of the stuff that a reporter should do, which is to, verify, vet the information, make sure it's as accurate as possible, take that as a given. But in addition to that, an outlet is going to have to be sure, is this going to, I mean, to use old-fashioned terms, is this going to move enough issues of our magazine to be worth the hassle we're about to get? Because yes, there is the noble intent of journalism to make the people informed of things they should know, but there's also the business reality, which is you say stuff that sells. And if you're going to invite a ton of scrutiny and possibly legal harassment from somebody like Gaiman, you're going to want to make a bigger splash than just, I felt pressured because he was famous and I was young. Again, that's not to excuse what happened to Claire at all. But again, I do understand why larger outlets didn't pick it up and how she would have ended up talking to a smaller thing like a podcast like this, especially one that historically isn't trying to be a venue for breaking important stories or do journalism really at all. Hey, just a super quick note about something just so there's no confusion, because I've seen some people get their wires crossed and conflate these things. It is only Claire so far who has said she went to other outlets and they didn't pick up the story. None of the people who went to Tortoise Media included in their story that they had gone to other outlets and were turned away. The only person who tried to pursue it at all was Scarlett. She went to the police. She never talked about trying to go to the press prior to talking with Tortoise Media. Okay, back to it. But in 2022, she actually backed out. And the reason she backed out was following that whole session with her therapist, she actually got in touch with Gaiman again. And she ended up having a phone conversation with him. And in that phone call, at the time, in the moment, she felt reassured.
Aside from excuse making and some defensiveness, he did everything right. Like, he said the right things. He let me talk. He said he was sorry. And then he asked me what he could do to help. So I gave him the information of the Rape Crisis Agency, where I initially received counseling. And he said he would make a hefty donation. So that was when I messaged you again. And I said I didn't feel like I needed to do the podcast anymore.
Because what she claims he said to her was that, I'm glad you told me. I didn't realize. This is why I don't engage with fans this way.
I went back and I looked at my notes from the phone call, and some things stood out to me in the way they hadn't before, particularly a comment that he had made about his fans. He said, "This is why I have always kept fans at arm's length." And I wrote that down initially because I found it really reassuring, right? Like, I took it as confirmation of what I'd been hoping for, which was that he'd never done this before with anyone else.
And if he told her that, it's a lie. We know it's a lie because K happened a decade prior. So I think that was probably the breaking point for Claire when she heard the Tortoise Media podcast and heard Kay's story and how much it was like her own, and that he would say to her, "Oh, I've never done this with anyone else." Yeah, I could understand why that would be what made her reverse things. I guess it is also said by her that she said both. Well, she definitely said to herself and possibly said to DeBoer as well, if other women come forward, then we're going to do this because I will want to support them. But at the time after that phone call with Gaiman, she made the decision not to be the first woman to speak. Because being the first woman to speak is terrifying. And there's a lot of discouragement from doing so, as I've talked about in this and the other video. Now, to circle back to what happened in the tour bus, again, without being super explicit about it, while she never said no, she also didn't fully behave the way that he was asking her to. And he eventually kind of backed off and said something along the lines of, "I think I'm going to have to let you go," which was the exact thing that she was scared of. They maintained some correspondence following that, but that was kind of the end of things physically at that point. She describes having recurrent trauma dreams. Like, she would tell herself, consciously say to herself, no, it wasn't bad what he did. It was fine. But then she'd have trauma dreams, recurring ones, with him saying the things to her that he said in real life, and she'd wake up panicked. So it was clear that she hadn't processed what the experience actually was for her. Again, regardless of what he perceives it to have been. And we don't get any Gaiman's account statements on this. This is a one-sided podcast that never pretends to be anything else. One of the things I really appreciated about Claire's account is towards the end, she points out very accurately, I feel, that the abuse of power didn't have to happen. It was not automatic or inherent to the situation that that power would be abused. And also, it did not necessarily have to be something that Gaiman would realize he was doing, but it is still what happened.
Yeah, I mean, most people in that position, where those positions of power in their relationships, like maybe they're older or celebrities or they have more money, or like they don't, thankfully, don't want to hurt or abuse their partners. And I hope they take away that, like, it's not an inevitability, but there is a much higher risk, right, of accidental boundary violations and coercion and abuse of power. And I'm curious what you think about this, because I've been thinking about this a lot, about like, well, what do you do, right? Like, what do you do when that power dynamic is present and you love each other and you want to have that space where consent is possible? And I think it's not like to burn all your money or quit your job or give up your celebrity status, but to start those conversations, those ongoing conversations about consent, and to name the power dynamics that might make that consent difficult for your partner, and just create a space where your partner is entirely comfortable with saying no without fear of consequences.
Now, I personally am of the opinion that in a fan and the object of their fandom situation, that discrepancy is so imbalanced that, like, even if the power is not abused intentionally, and one could argue Gaiman did not intend to abuse that power dynamic, it still happened regardless, because she wanted to be near him. And this was what he wanted from her. And she wouldn't say no. Again, things did not continue on, at least physically, for as long as they did with people like Kay or Scarlett or Caroline. But according to Claire, at least, it still happened. It was a tough listen. And I'll be honest that trying to parse all that, especially after listening to the Tortoise Media stuff, it did make me almost feel like apologizing a little bit to Tortoise Media, because while I can criticize their presentation all day long, the fact that they had the supporting stuff, it just makes it easier to talk about. Whereas with Claire, all I can do is convey what she says happened. And the only thing that's left is you either believe her or you don't. And I kind of missed being able to say, okay, even if you disbelieve that, there's definitely this. I missed that concreteness. Like I said, part of me was tempted to apologize to Tortoise Media. I'm not going to, though, because, as I alluded to before, I now know where the Gaiman's position and Gaiman's account statements came from. Shout out to the commenter JaneBow9714 for bringing this to my attention. Apparently, over on their TikTok account, I think the timing was like as part of a promotion for the new episode drop, Tortoise Media put out a thing on TikTok featuring Paul Granagalizia and Rachel Johnson, and this bit gets dropped.
Neil Gaiman did not provide any on-the-record response to multiple detailed requests for comment on the new as well as the previous set of allegations, but made his position clear through his lawyers.
To reiterate, I went into this entire thing prior to that first video really only wanting an answer to one question. They were printing what they said were denials from Gaiman. I wanted to know where those came from because they were never presented in the form of actual literal quotes. That was the only thing I wanted to know, and at no point in all 5 of those episodes, including the new one, did they ever say that. And it wasn't for any of the reasons I saw people postulate in the comments, people who were trying to defend Tortoise Media. Because there were people who said, like, well, maybe they have to word it this way because they're trying to protect a source that's, like, close to him or something. No. That's not what happened. And on the flip side, I saw people speculating that maybe Gaiman's position actually came from what the women said that he'd said to them in their interactions. And in fact, there was nothing from Gaiman at all other than these women's stories, even though the podcast presented it as if there were actually two sides to this story. There are people who speculated that, which really shows the harm that was done by Tortoise Media not flat out saying where they got this from, because it left the door open for conspiratorial thinking that undermines the exact stories that you are trying to put forward. If you want me to guess as to why, at no point in all 5 of those goddamn podcasts, they never said, according to Gaiman's lawyers, is because that statement distances Gaiman himself. And they wanted it to seem like they were presenting his actual side, not the legal defense being prepped by his lawyers. Because if they were upfront about that, then it would have been clearer to audiences, oh, this isn't necessarily what Gaiman believes or what Gaiman personally remembers. This is what his lawyers are presenting, which, not to say that, lawyers lie. That's not where I'm going. But, lawyers are going to present what is the best legal version of events, not necessarily the most honest version of events in terms of what Gaiman actually remembers or believes. But you present it without indicating that, and you leave it to imply to your audience that this is what Gaiman himself said, believes, etc. And it's not. It's lines from his legal team. A legal team that in the podcast itself, not once did you ever mention talking to or being contacted by. And in that goddamn TikTok, they made it clear that this was the information that they got for the original batch of podcasts too. They could have said at any point, and they didn't. I hate this podcast so goddamn much. How bad they are at what they do. And how much they personally piss me off. Doesn't negate the pattern that we're seeing. And at this point, it is a pattern. And at this point, I will start to talk about my own personal thoughts. If you hit the time jump, hey, welcome back. So the reason that I expect this and hope that this will be the last time I ever have to talk about these allegations with Gaiman is that my expectation from here on out is that, maybe Gaiman responds eventually, but given that we now know these positions were put forward by his lawyers, then one can expect these are the positions he's going to maintain. For further questions, if this does ever end up in court, again, reiterating, it's not in court anywhere, but if it does, these are the same positions one could expect him to hold. And I expect that if other women come forward, and to be honest, I expect that that will happen, those stories are probably going to align with what we already know. Because at this point, with 5 women's stories in, we have a very clear and distinct pattern. Not of physical violence, not of physically forcing himself onto women, but by coercing and holding power over women and abusing that dynamic. Maybe knowingly, maybe not. I'll touch on that in a second. But that is what is happening. That is the pattern that we see. And I don't think any more people coming forward is going to alter what the pattern is. It's only going to reinforce it with more examples. So barring some future reporting, whether it be from goddamn Tortoise Media or be it from an outlet that I actually would have more faith in, unless future reporting completely upends everything with a completely different spin on events, I don't think there's going to be anything more for me to add. as more people come forward, as more women speak out, I think it's just going to reaffirm the pattern that we've seen. So that's why I intend this to be the last time I'm going to talk about it. As to what my thoughts are, well, I was kind of cagey about being definitive about my own feelings last time, largely because I was dealing with Tortoise Media pretty much exclusively and didn't have anything else to look at and compare with. And because I had so much, I think, justified reason to distrust that platform, not because of anything else they've ever reported or anything I've ever heard about them, but just because I listened to those podcasts and those podcasts are a mess. But because of that, it was really hard for me to come down on what my feelings were. So instead, I kind of laid out a spectrum last time, a spectrum of best case scenario to worst case scenario. Now, the worst case scenario hasn't changed. The worst case scenario is still what it was before, which is the absolute worst case scenario is that he knows what he's doing. This is deliberate. He's predatory. He is seeking out these vulnerable women with the intent of harming them because he gets off on the idea of causing damage. That is the worst case scenario. And while that is still technically the worst case scenario, I think it is far less likely to be accurate than last time. And I didn't think it was very likely last time either. Because the pattern here is not one of deliberate harm. And the pattern is much more along the lines of someone who just doesn't care. But I'll come back to that. Let's cover the best case scenario, because that has changed. Worst case scenario hasn't. Best case has. The previous best case scenario was that he flatly did not understand that this power imbalance made these encounters non-consensual for the women involved, even though they did go forward with some of the stuff that he wanted to do. And he just did not ever understand or notice the pattern in his own behavior, that he was ignorant and was damaging in his ignorance. That was the old best case scenario. I don't feel comfortable saying that that is a reasonable best case scenario anymore, because we know at this point that some of these women talked to him in specific about his behavior. Caroline did it by bringing it up in a legal proceeding. Now, granted, maybe that makes it easier for someone like Gaiman to dismiss and discard, like, well, she's just doing it for money or what have you. But we also have Claire. Claire, who talked to him, and in that conversation on the phone, he indicates, oh, no, this has never happened before. But we know it has. So at this point, I can't give him the benefit of the doubt that he is just unaware. If he is ignorant, he is willfully ignorant. He is choosing to not recognize the pattern, to not look at the encounters he has had, to not look at the outcomes for the women that he has engaged with in his life, and to not think about what that means about his behavior. If he doesn't know, it's because he's chosen not to know. Now, between those two extremes, my own opinion that I do feel more comfortable settling on now is that he's probably closer to that best case scenario than the worst one. That's still bad. That's still really bad. But, despite Tortoise Media's attempts to vilify and smear the BDSM community, I don't think the man's a literal sadist. He might be a sexual sadist based off his encounters with Scarlett, but I don't think he's a literal sadist. I don't think he actually gets off or wants to cause pain, emotional damage to these women. I think he just doesn't care. And I don't mean that when he finds out that it happened, he doesn't care that it happened. I suspect he probably does a little. But when I say he doesn't care, I mean he doesn't care enough about whether or not the way he goes about these things is harmful to other people to ever stop and consider and possibly change his behavior. I don't think he wants to hurt anybody, but I also don't think he gives priority to other people's potential harm over his own desires. I think he has been operating for 40 years on the basis of move forward and wait for a no. And in 40 years, despite multiple women having negative outcomes and multiple of them telling him that at some point down the line, he hasn't stopped to examine. He doesn't care enough about the damage that he's doing to compromise his own pleasure by actually altering his behavior. One of the things that was brought up by Claire was Gaiman's autism, which was something briefly touched on in the original set of 4 podcasts from Tortoise Media. I didn't dig into it because, boy, is that an entire ableist issue. But according to Claire, he would cite his diagnosis of autism as a reason why he would misread signals.
And then he brought his autism diagnosis into it as something of an explanation for why he wasn't able to read my body language. And I told him that's not an excuse, and that struggling with identifying sarcasm and reading facial expressions and social cues, that's entirely different from continuing to grope an intoxicated fan when they're actively pushing you away.
The most generous I could possibly be on that matter, and speaking as someone who, to the best of my knowledge at least, is not autistic. I'm certainly not diagnosed with it. I do have ADHD. I am neurodivergent. But to the best of my knowledge, I'm not autistic. I've never been assessed for it. But anyways, but speaking as someone who has multiple people in my life, who I am very close, who mean a lot to me, who are, the most generous I can be in terms of how that impacts anything is that, okay, if you know that your autism makes it difficult for you to pick up on social cues, and if you know from experience that that failure to pick up on social cues makes you liable to do something that is going to be damaging and harmful and traumatic to another person, which, to be very clear, is not something that is typical of autism at all. But let's take Claire's account of Gaiman at its word for a second. If all that is true, you do bear some responsibility to be aware of and account for that behavior. And no, I'm not talking about masking. I'm talking about clear communication. You can tell someone, hey, I have a tendency to misread things. Is this actually okay? Which is something that, by all accounts, Gaiman does not do and has never done. To use examples of some people who are close to me, there are people who, they get anxiety, not inherently because of their autism, but in connection to it, because they know that because they have a tendency to misread or fail to read cues, they will ask for clarification and ask people to be super explicit and lay stuff out to the point that it annoys other people. And then these people I know have anxiety about their interactions because they're like, oh my gosh, I'm annoying everybody because I'm asking for clarification because I want to be sure I get it right and that I don't miss things because of my dang autism. My point in all that being, as troublesome as it is to go through, and as much as I have all the sympathy in the world, if you know you miss cues, then you should not be moving forward into a situation where the safety of people involved is dependent on you knowing those social cues. It becomes all the more important that you be explicit in your questions, in your intents, and in your seeking of consent. And even then, even if he did that, most of these situations still wouldn't be okay. Because again, he had massive amounts of power over these women. In 2 cases, it was fans. In 1 case, it was a woman who was financially dependent on him for her home. And in another, it was a woman in his employ and or the employ of his wife at the time. Those situations, even if he did what I just talked about, still wouldn't be okay. But I just want to touch on the autism briefly because it did come up again here, even though I did not touch on it in the previous video that I did. So to bring it all back, and what I think is most likely, I think we have a man who knows what he wants, who has never bothered to explore the dynamics of the situations he finds himself in, and he pursues the things that he would like on a willfully ignorant assumption that if the other person doesn't want it, they'll just say no. And how sincere his ignorance of the harm of that doesn't matter. It might matter to him, his sense of mind, his soul, but that's between him and whatever is out there that you believe has power over people. That's a distinction without a difference when it comes to the harm that he's done. If somebody slaps you in the face on purpose or swings their arms around, slaps you in the face by accident, the pain is the same. Your intent didn't matter. He's causing harm. He's causing damage. And if he is honestly going to try and say that he didn't understand the power dynamics, then that means he's just walking around constantly swinging his arms around and acting as if it's not his fault when people get smacked and hurt. That was a slightly tortured metaphor, but that's where I'm at this. I feel comfortable settling on that as my own personal assessment. You don't have to share it. If you think it's closer to the worst case or closer to the best case, that's your call to make. That's where I'm landing. So as far as the future of me talking about Gaiman again, I never intend to talk about controversies or allegations with him again, because I expect there to be more, them to be in the same vein. It's just going to reinforce what we already know. I don't have anything to add to that. And I do not feel that I will have enough material to do anything meaningful. I'd be dissecting it just to dissect it. I don't want to. I have other things to do with my life. However, as far as Gaiman's works, the two main things that were up in the air were the second season of Sandman and a potential third season for Good Omens. I know that a third season was confirmed, but that was back in December, and we don't know where that thing stands right now. It's not currently in production actively, but we don't know if scripts have already been written, if he was in the process of working on scripts, if he hadn't worked on scripts yet, and whether he has or hasn't. Removing him from that project is difficult, because not only was he the co-writer of the original work that it was based on, but that he and the late Sir Terry Pratchett worked on, but in addition to that, he wrote the script for every single episode of the first season, and he co-wrote the script for every single episode of the second season. He was the co-showrunner for both seasons, and his other co-showrunner already wasn't coming back for the third season because he was moving on to other stuff. So the ability of this thing to pick up and move forward, if he hasn't already written scripts, which is kind of what happened with the fourth season of Castlevania, because that show was written by Warren Ellis, and I don't want to go through all the stuff with him. Although the stuff with him bears more than a slight resemblance with the stuff that went on with Gaiman. But anyway, between when the third and the fourth seasons of that show came out, a whole bunch of allegations against him came out. However, I still felt relatively comfortable watching the final season of that show because he had turned in his scripts before the allegations came forward. So I didn't have to feel like I was supporting a piece of work that was going to continue to support him in future. And like, even though they knew what he did, like they didn't know, but he'd already done his part in that. With Gaiman and Good Omens, we don't know if that's the case. We don't know if scripts are in. We don't know if they've been written. We don't know if they've been drafted. We don't know anything. Sandman, second season, by contrast, is still in active production, so the writing portion has been finished for quite a while. And Gaiman was not as directly involved in the production end of that as he was with Good Omens. I don't know what my comfort level is going to be with watching it. It's possible I might still watch it. If I do, I have no intention of talking about it positively or negatively on here or on my my secondary channel, Break Room of Geeks, because I won't want to give air to it. I'm invested enough in Sandman as a property, and also I enjoyed the first season that for myself I might still watch, but I don't know at this point. I do not intend to take in any new works of Neil Gaiman. But the thing with Good Omens and Sandman is these weren't, I mean, they were new-ish, but they were adaptations, and they were things that I did have an existing investment in. If a third season of Good Omens happens, I don't know. There might be a similar situation where maybe I'll watch it for the closure, because it was intended to be the final season, but I probably won't talk about it. That's if it even still happens now, because like I said, who knows where things were in the process on that. It also means that I'm going to have to scrap a Good Omens themed burlesque number that I've been thinking about for a while. I was going to do it as a duet. I was going to use the song Angel with a Shotgun. It's going to be a lot of fun. And it's not going to happen now. I ain't comfortable doing it. Now, that's sort of a limp final note to end on, just talking about, the future of this channel, but I don't know what else to do at this point. We have enough stories from enough people that unless you are going to spin some massive conspiracy of women across the globe with a massive stretch in age range ranging from their 20s through their 60s, all secretly colluding to take down this one man. Unless you're going to spin that sort of conspiracy narrative, and if you're going to, please go do it somewhere else. Unless you're going to do that, I don't think that you can claim that there's no fire behind the smoke. I don't think you can reasonably claim that. So I had to come to my conclusions based on that. I don't, at this point, intend to get rid of the Gaiman stuff that I already have. The only stuff I've ever gotten rid of from creators who I used to admire was anything tied to J.K. Rowling and Bill Cosby. That stuff, like, I couldn't even look at it anymore. But stuff that stars Kevin Spacey, or was directed by Bryan Singer, or stuff tied to Joss Whedon, like Buffy and Angel, and multiple comic books I have written by Warren Ellis. I've still got them. I haven't touched them. I haven't rewatched them. I haven't reread them. But it didn't feel right to get rid of them. Like, they're still meaningful to me. I still remember what those things meant to me. And I don't feel like throwing that out. Will I ever re-engage with these things? I don't know. Like, I don't know. It's been the case with pretty much everything so far that this has happened to. I don't really need to re-engage with that. And maybe at some point I will with some of this stuff, but I haven't yet. And Gaiman's now on that pile. I intend for this to be my final word when it comes to allegations against Neil Gaiman. I hope you found this helpful. I really hope I managed to keep this shorter than the last one. I don't know. I haven't been keeping track. So who even knows? But if you slogged all the way through this, I appreciate it greatly. Thank you very much. And if you want to support what I do have a Patreon. And any amount that you help with over there is greatly appreciated. There are perks. There's a Patreon supporter Discord. You get to see my docket, what I'm planning to do for the month. Usually stuff is up a little early on there, a few days to a week, depending on where I'm at in my schedule. But don't worry too much about that, though. You know, the like, share, subscribe, you know, all that stuff. What I want you to remember, what I really want you to remember as you process information about somebody who maybe you admired, or you process stories that sound like ones that are experiences you went through, what I need you to remember is that you are beautiful, you're valid, and you're loved. You are the council. I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. And now to thank my highest supporting patrons: Robin Moore, Zubin Lutfula, Goddess Elida, Welsh Wrestling Geeks, Oliver B., Melissa Pedersen, Tarak, The Thing That Goes Doink in the Anime, Gene Foray, Movie Turtle, Ulrich Bogdan, Loki Eris, Melinda Walters, Auntie Tate 808, Becky Sparks, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Casperl, Dave Hall, White Bearish, Rosalind Bennett, Pal Barabajagal, Mira G, and Sir Didymus is my favorite. Oh look, you actually get a face this time and not just butts.